So government then changes first because it's made Parliament, the House of Commons, is made much more broadly representative, right? Simple as that. It also changes territorially from the beginning of the 18th century when Scotland is incorporated. Remember, union between England and Scotland of the early 17th century is a purely parliamentary union. It's really important we understand this. There's a great deal of nonsense purveyed by Scottish nationalists and whatever, that it's some sort of act of English colonization. This is the absolute reverse of the truth. If you look at the Act of Union, you've first of all got to look at why some of the Scots, particularly the rich and the powerful in Scotland, are so keen on it. They're so keen on it because Scotland was bankrupt. Scotland had tried to imitate England and create an overseas empire. The Darien scheme in the Isthmus of Panama and all the rest of it, it had failed horribly and bankrupted Scotland. So Scotland is a tiny bankrupt country, probably 500,000. Tiny. I mean, England isn't very much. Remember, this is early 18th century England itself is probably only 6 million. I mean, it's very, very small. The enormous multiplication of our population only takes place after 1800. That's the moment at which we breach the 10 million mark because of industrialization and the need for industrial labor. And you suddenly alter the rules of ownership of housing and so on, which have been used quite deliberately to suppress population growth. You alter it to multiply population growth, which is why you get the great sprawls of the towns and the slums of Victorian England to accommodate the vastly increased population that's needed for early stage industrialization. But Scotland, then, going back to it is a bankrupt country, and it's above all, it's desperate for two things. It's desperate for access to the English Empire, this already huge trading empire that's built on the back of the English Navy, which is paid for by parliamentary taxes. It's also the Scottish ruling. Remember, Scotland is a country bitterly divided territorially between the north and the south, between the Highlands and the Lowlands, with the Highlands on the whole being Roman Catholic and the Lowlands being a radical form of Protestantism, Calvinism, Presbyterianism. And the ruling elements are in the south, are in the Lowlands, and they want protection against the threat of a Catholicizing monarchy and so on. So England is able to do that. The English want it because they want to close their back door. Scotland has always been the back door for invaders, and the English, of course, engaged in a vast war with Louis XIV, and there'd been traditional friendship between England and between Scotland and France, known as the Old Alliance, to keep the English under control, going back to the days of Edward I and Edward III and the 100 Years' War and all of that. But when union is negotiated, it is negotiated. When union is negotiated in 1707, Scotland preserves everything, apart from its independent monarchy, which had already gone with the Union of Crowns in 1603, after Elizabeth I dies without a direct heir, and James VI of Scotland becomes also James I of England. So there was already a Union of Crowns, but you bring about a union of parliaments. The Scottish Parliament is suppressed, and instead Scotland is deliberately overrepresented on fiscal basis. I mean, they do all the calculations based on the relative wealth of England and Scotland, and they deliberately decide to overweight Scottish representation in the English Parliament. Otherwise, Scotland preserves all the lineaments of an independent monarchy. You have a separate system of law. You have a separate system of education. You have a separate system of a separate ecclesiastical system. The monarch actually changes religion when they go north. The monarch becomes Presbyterian. It's an extraordinary story. The position, for example, of the Scottish universities is the 5 historic Scottish universities is actually written into the Act of Union. There's a wonderful story told of Margaret Thatcher beginning an early anti-universities campaign, and the university she wished to make an example of was the University of Aberdeen, one of the entrenched universities in Scotland, which was going through a very bad patch at the time. My friend Conrad Russell, that's the Earl Russell, Professor the Earl Russell, Bertrand Russell's youngest son, was a wonderfully eccentric liberal peer, and he rose in the House of Lords. And of course, you can't actually refer to the House of Commons. You couldn't in those days. You have to refer to it as the other place. Did the right honourable lady on the place realise that he gathered that there was a proposal to abolish the University of Aberdeen? Did the right honourable lady in the other place realise that in order to abolish the University of Aberdeen, she would first have to carry out a little technical measure and repeal the Act of Union, which immediately squashed that notion. So Scotland then, it is very remarkable. It is purely a parliamentary union, which of course is why devolution, which unpicks that parliamentary union, is such a catastrophe. The only theoretical grounds, remember, there was never, and it's really important we understand this, the English Parliament was the representative assembly of a nation. The extraordinary tension that's created with the Act of Parliament is that in 1707, because of preserving the absolute separateness of Scotland and never making any serious attempt at creating the idea of Britishness, it was slightly toyed with, particularly by Scots, interestingly enough. The sort of Scot who wanted to make a great success of himself in England was very keen on the idea of Britain. The English were very, very much opposed to it, and things like the North Britain are satirical. By the way, there was an attempt at calling Scotland North Britain. If you actually think of a play, The Importance of Being Earnest, I remember this vividly because I actually played John Worthington. John Worthington, like all respectable Victorian gentleman, had 3 addresses. He had one in Belgravia, he had another one somewhere in the home counties, and then he also had the Sporran, Fifeshire, North Britain, and that's this is the middle of the 1890s. But there's no attempt. Nobody ever talks about Britons except in rural Britannia. People talk of themselves as English or Scots or Welsh or Irish. Britishness is for export. It's what you are abroad, which means there is this great paradox. The mother of parliaments is not the representative assembly of a single nation. There is not a British nation. I confronted this. I mean, people like Gordon Brown have tried to invent one, usually by trying to suppress England, but that's another matter. I confronted this back in the late 90s, the early 2000s, when Sharma was making his history of Britain, which is fundamentally factitious. There isn't a history of Britain. Up to 1707, England and Scotland have radically different histories. Ireland always remains different. Rural Wales remains different. We were, always have been, multinational. And the creation of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland was from the beginning unspokenly and then increasingly spokenly a multinational state. In other words, there's something very extraordinary about this. The world's most successful nation state, which Great Britain was, it conquers the world, for heaven's sake, with the British Empire, was not a nation. There's a real paradox. And much of what's going on, much of what's happening with the New Labour experiment is precisely the result of that fact.